aside and rebuked him. This is Peter rebuking God. And in that moment, Peter was fighting against God. And that's why Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." And if you want to go ahead and turn to Jonah, as we read through Jonah, you're going to see that Jonah was a man that was fighting against God. And you may wonder, well, in what ways can we fight against God? And the answer to that is there's a variety of ways. There's lots of different ways in which we can fight against God. One of them, you remember when Saul had been, before he became Paul, he's persecuting Christians, imprisoning them, killing them, and Jesus confronts him on the Damascus road, and Jesus says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Now, you read that at first glance and you're thinking, wait a minute, Jesus is already in heaven at this point. Jesus has not been on the earth for Saul to persecute. Why does Jesus say, "You're persecuting me"? Because to fight against God's people is to fight against who? God. If you mess with God's people, you mess with God. Now, there's people that call themselves Christians and they like to criticize and slander and attack God's people, even people they go to church with. And when they do that, they think that they're just merely attacking people that they go to church with, attacking people that serve God, but who they're really attacking they're attacking the God that those people are serving. Another way we can fight against God is, you may be here this morning and there is some sin in your life. You know it's there and you know it's wrong, but you're not doing anything about it. You're holding on to it. You're harboring that sin. If you're doing that, you're fighting against God. And there's different ways, but the one I want us to think about today is this. God has a plan. God has a mission for each of our lives. Don't ever ask the question, has God called me to do something? Of course He has. He has called you to do something. The question is, am I doing what God has called me to do? You know, there's people who think that just because they come to church, they're doing what God has called them to do. God did not save you and change you and equip you to come to church. Amen? God, you go to church to be equipped and encouraged to do what He's called you to do. So let's all ask ourselves this question this morning. Are we fulfilling the ministry that God has given us? Are we doing what God has called us to do? And if we are resisting the calling of God, then we're fighting against God. And what we're going to see in this story is that that's a fight you don't win. You will not win that fight. You're going to see in this story that the only thing we can do is to bow down our knees before Jesus Christ and surrender to Him as His slave. So let's start Jonah chapter 1 and verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah rose up to flee to Tarshish. Everybody say Tarshish. All right, just making it plain. I'm not the only one that's going to mispronounce that word as we read this story. Tarshish, that's a hard word to say. So he's got up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So he went down to Joppa, found a ship which was going to Tarshish, paid the fare, and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. And the first thing that comes jumping off the page to you in this is that Jonah, the prophet of God, is rebelling against God, or to put it another way, he's fighting against God. Jonah is fighting against God, and that should really stand out because, listen to this, Jonah is the only prophet to have ever blatantly said no to God. He's the only prophet that has ever looked at God and said, "No, I'm not going to go and preach to these people that you've told me to preach to. I'm not doing it." He's the only one to ever have done that. He's breaking new ground. And I tell you this, Jonah could not have possibly made it more clear that his answer was no. I tell you why. He has been told to go to Nineveh. All right, Nineveh is about 500 miles northeast of Jerusalem. Well, Jonah doesn't go northeast. He goes west. In other words, he goes in the complete opposite direction. And not only does he go in the complete opposite direction, he goes in the complete opposite direction as far as he possibly can. Tarshish is on the southern tip of Spain. And y'all, that's 2,500 miles away from Jerusalem, or 3,000 miles away from where he's supposed to be. He couldn't even lie and say, "Well, Lord, I'm just taking the long way. I'm just taking the scenic route." You don't go 3,000 miles out of the way when you're taking the scenic route. That's what I'm saying. He couldn't make it more clear that his answer to God is no, absolutely not. I'm not going to do this. And I want to point something out. Verse 3. It says, he rose up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. And then he goes down and says, went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. What this does is it equates going away to Tarshish with going away from who? God. In other words, to fight against God's plan is to fight against God. You cannot separate the two. You cannot. Now, I know that we like to try to separate the two. I know that there's times when I have tried to separate the two. In other words, don't be a Christian who says, okay, I know that I'm not doing God's will in my life right now, but me and God are cool. All right? I'm right with God even though I'm not doing what God has called me to do. Well, can you say that? You cannot say that. Jesus said to his disciples, you are my friends if you do what I've commanded you to do. Now, this begs the question. Gentlemen, what's your problem? Why don't you, you're a preacher, man. Why don't you want to go and preach? And if you have sensitive ears, you may want to cover. Jonah did not want to go and preach to these Assyrians in Nineveh because he hated them. He absolutely hated them. To take it even further, and this will come out even more tonight when we look at the second half of the book. Jonah wanted these people to go to hell. He wanted it. The last thing he wanted was to see an Assyrian saved. Now the question is, why did Jonah hate these Assyrians? Some people say, well, he hated them because they were pagans. Well, there's a lot of people that were pagans. And I tell you, the premier god of the Assyrians was Dagon. And Brian's going to pull you up a picture here. Dagon was a weird one. Is that not the weirdest false god you've ever seen? He was the fish god. He's half man and half fish. He's Little Mermaid in reverse. Just really weird. But, I mean, that's part of it, I guess, but that's really not the reason why he hated the Assyrians. Because, I mean, there were, in this time especially, there's Israelites that are worshiping false gods. Let me just tell you that Jonah was not the only person that hated the Assyrians. The Jews were not the only people that hated the Assyrians. The only people that did not hate the Assyrians were the Assyrians. People hated them because they were grossly brutal and violent. And just to illustrate that to you, the Assyrians at this time, they're growing, they're taking over more regions, overthrowing more and more cities, and their battle tactics were just barbaric. One of their kings, Ashurnabal II, he made this boast. He said, I flayed many right through my land and draped their skins on the walls. And when he said that he draped their skins on the walls, he meant that literally. One of the things the Assyrians were known for was, as they would overthrow a city, they would take citizens and skin them alive and take their skins and drape them over the walls of the city, in their city. They were known for gouging out eyes, cutting off noses, cutting off ears of people alive in order to send a message to other nations. They were known for impaling people on tall stakes for everybody to see. Another boast made by this same king, Ashurnabal II, he said, I burned their young boys and girls alive. A pillar of heads I erected in front of the city. The event that he is referring to was, there was a time when they overthrew a certain city and they brought out certain of the nobles and leaders in that city, cut off their heads, tied ropes to the heads, and made the citizens of that city wear those heads around their neck like a necklace. These people were dogs. Brutal, violent, bloodthirsty dogs, and that's putting it lightly. That's why Jonah doesn't want to go and preach to the people in Nineveh. He doesn't want to have anything to do with it. The last thing he wants is to have anything to do with some Assyrian receiving salvation. Maybe a modern day equivalent would be, God calls us to go and preach to the Muslim extremists. I spent a few hours with a man last week who did 2 tours of duty. He went to Iraq and to Afghanistan. And he told me about some of the things that those people do. He told me about an occasion where there are people that will sell mud bricks on the side of the road because they still build their dwellings out of these mud bricks. And that these extremists were putting IEDs in these mud bricks. Somebody goes to get one and it blows up. He talked about a time when they found an IED inside of a dead dog. The things they do to women, sending children to their death, the videos of them doing the beheadings. These people are dogs. I know CNN doesn't like to say that, but it's the truth. And I know some people say, well, not all Muslims are like that. The honest ones are. And what I mean by that is the ones that are true to the teachings of the Quran, they are like that. So you could say then that this is Jonah being told to go and preach to the Muslim extremists of his day. And Jonah's response is, I'm not doing it. I'm not going there. I'm not having anything to do with those people. I'm out of here. And he runs away. And maybe the only thing that's foolish is thinking that you can win a fight against God, is thinking that you can hide from God. Psalm 139, we can pull that up. Psalm 139, this is 7 to 10. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol or the grave, behold, you're there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, your right hand will lay hold of me. That's another way of saying that you can run, but you cannot what? You cannot hide from the Lord. You can run, but you can't hide. So, Jonah chapter 1, verse 4. The Lord hurled a great wind on the sea, and there was a great storm on the sea, so that the ship was about to break up. Then the sailors became afraid, and every man cried to his God. They threw the cargo which was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them, but Jonah had gone below into the hold of the ship, laid down, and fallen, not just asleep, but sound asleep. Now these sailors here, they did not stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. They are the real deal. They are professionals. They are legit. They have seen their fair share of storms on the Mediterranean Sea, and when those storms come up, they know how to take care of business. They've seen some bad storms in their life, but they've never seen a storm like this one. This storm is major bad. You know, we like to joke here in Alabama. There's tornadoes, and you're watching the weather, and you know it's getting bad when James Spann does what? Takes that, when you see them suspenders, get to the shelter, he's rolling his sleeves up. You know it's getting bad then. Well, this storm is so bad, the Jewish James Spann, he doesn't even know what to say. Doesn't even know what to say. Why is this storm so bad? Let me ask you a question. Is this a natural storm? It's a supernatural storm, because verse 4, the Lord hurled a great wind on the sea. Usually a storm just gradually progresses, right? Well, not this storm. It was like you flipped the switch. Everything is fine. The seas are calm, and all of a sudden, boom, the wind and the waves is crashing. It says it's so bad that the ship is actually about to break. That's what happens when we fight against God. Now, I understand that sometimes there are storms in our life, and it's simply because we live in a fallen world with fallen people where bad things just happen. I get that. But there's also times when a storm comes into our life because God is teaching us a lesson. We're running from Him, we're resisting Him, we're fighting Him, and He sends that storm into our lives to break us, to humble us, so that we will surrender to His will. And by the way, while all these guys are crying and screaming for their lives, tell my mama I love her, praying to their God, throwing stuff overboard, what's Jonah doing? He is asleep, and I may mention, he's not just asleep, he's sound asleep. Fighting God is exhausting, isn't it? That is an exhausting thing to do. When you're fighting Him and running from Him, isn't it true that it makes you miserable? It will wear you down to the bone. I will tell you without question, the most miserable I have ever been in my life was when I was resisting God's call to the ministry. I knew He was calling me to pastoral ministry. I was fine with preaching, but I didn't want to be a pastor. That is not what I wanted to do. And I would make excuses, Brother Mike. I'd say, well, I'm not doing that, but at least I'm preaching. You're either doing what God told you to do or you're not. Amen? There's no in between. There's no in the middle. And I had my fleeing to Tarshish experience. I went to Tarshish and I thought, I'm going to get a degree and I'm going to make something out of myself. I'm going to do my own thing. And you know what God did? It was storm after storm after storm after storm. And I learned, that was about a year. And I learned during that time, I learned that you can run, but you can't hide. I learned that it doesn't matter where you go and it doesn't matter what you do, God is right there. And His sheep hear His voice and they know Him, and He'll make sure that eventually they follow Him. He'll make sure of that. And I also learned that it doesn't matter how strong you think your ship is. It will not hold up against a God storm. It will not. Verse 6, the captain approached him and said, "How is it that you're sleeping?" That's what I want to know, man. Jonah, what are you doing? And he says, "Get up. Call on your God. Perhaps your God will be concerned about us so that we'll not perish." In other words, Jonah, it's your turn. We done prayed to the fish man. All right, now it's time for you to pray to your God. Now imagine that. Imagine that. This is Jonah, and he doesn't worship the fish man. He worships Yahweh. He worships Jehovah. He worships the true God that made everything out of nothing in 6 days. And not only that, Jonah is a prophet, for crying out loud, and the man has not prayed a lick. Can you imagine that? He's not prayed a bit. He's about to die. Everybody else is about to die, but he's not prayed a bit. Why not? Because Jonah knows it'd be a complete waste of time. Jonah knows that when you're living in sin, when you're living in defiance against God, God does not hear your prayers. You may say, "Well, I don't buy that." All right, Isaiah 66:18. "If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me." So, up to this point, Jonah he's been like an undercover prophet. He's been an undercover believer. He's not telling them that he's been hiding from them that he follows the true God. He's been hiding from them that he's a preacher. He's been hiding from them that he and God are not on good terms. Well, verse 7, each man, these are just pagan sailors. They said to his mate, "Come, let us cast lots, so we may learn on whose account this calamity has struck us." Now, this was just a silly way of trying to determine what was going on. It's kind of like, you know how like you may do the draw the straws or something like that. This was just a non-biblical thing. But it says they cast lots, and with some divine intervention, the lot fell on Jonah. You know, that reminds me of the passage, "Be sure your sins will" what? God's going to find you. He's going to find you. Verse 8, and they said to him, "Tell us now, on whose account has this calamity struck us?" And then they say, "What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What's your country? From what people are you?" Now the cat's out of the bag. Now they know that they are in this mess because Jonah is in trouble with his God. And they're asking him some questions. "Who are you?" And notice they say, "What is your occupation?" No, like, what do you do? If I'm Jonah, I would be so embarrassed to say I'm a preacher. Wouldn't you be embarrassed? I'd say I'm a motivational speaker. I mean, I'd be so ashamed to say I'm a prophet of God. But Jonah fesses up, verse 9. He says to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. I follow the God of the Jews." And he qualifies that even more. "I follow the only God that is, the God who created everything that is." And now watch this, verse 10. "Then the men became extremely frightened, and they said to him, 'How could you do this? How could you do this?' For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them." Now, this is not something you see every day. They look at Jonah and say, "How could you do this? You're in trouble with your God and you got on this boat?" Isn't it something? They sound more like Christians than Jonah does. You know, this is usually backwards. Usually a lost person doesn't want to be around a believer because of that believer's righteousness. In this case, they don't want to be around a believer because of that believer's sin. If you're Jonah, this has got to be so embarrassing because he's being rebuked. He's being corrected by guys that worship the fish man. This is bad. Verse 11 says, "They said to him, 'What should we do to you that the sea may become calm for us?' And then it says this, for the sea was becoming increasingly stormy. Now that tells me something. The storm is not getting better. You know, it's not easing up. It's not even leveling out. It's getting worse. Isn't that how God works? You know, we may think that a God storm is a storm we can ride out, but you can't ride it out. We may think that, well, you know, I'm going to keep running and eventually this storm will get better. It will not get better. It will not get better. God, the waves will get higher, the wind will get harder, the rain will fall harder until you do what? Until you get on your face before God and surrender. Verse 12. He said to them, now watch this, pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will become calm for you, for I know that on account of me this great storm has come upon you. Now I read this and I'm thinking, now Jonah, is that really necessary? You know, if I'm Jonah, I'm going to be like, okay, God, I messed up. All right, I admit I was running from you, I messed up, but God, you know, we're kind of in the middle of the Mediterranean Ocean here. There's not really anywhere that I could go. So I'm going to ride, I'm going to finish this ride with them to Tarshish, and as soon as I get to Tarshish, I'll get up, I'll get on another boat and head back the other way. God doesn't work like that either, does he? The only way for that storm to stop was for Jonah to surrender to God's will, right? And the only way for him to surrender to God's will was to jump off. You know, to really surrender to God, when do you have to do it? To truly surrender to God, when do you have to do it? Tomorrow? When it's convenient? When it's safe? You got to do it when? Right now. Right now. To get right with God, you got to get right with God right now. You know, we may think that we can pencil God into our schedule. He has to become your schedule. We may think that we can fit Him into our agenda. He has to become your agenda. Jonah understood that. He said, if this storm's going to stop, I got to surrender to Him. I've got to repent of this direction that I'm going in, and the only way for me to do that is to get off the boat that's going in the wrong direction. So he says, throw me overboard. Sometimes doing things God's way is scary. Do you agree with that? Not all the time, but sometimes God's will can be scary, it can be costly, it can be painful. And I can tell you, there's times when we want to come up with some alternative way. These sailors here, they hated the idea of throwing a man overboard. They did not want to do things God's way. And so verse 13, the men rowed desperately to return to land. But they couldn't. What are they doing here? Same thing we do a lot of times. We know what God's way is, but that way looks kind of difficult, and so I'm going to try an alternative way. I'm going to row and go a different direction. I'm going to row as hard as I can. But the harder you row, what happens? The sea was becoming even stormier against them. God just turns up the heat. He turns up the dial. He turns up the pressure. We can row against His will until our hands are blistered and bleeding, but the storm is not going to calm until we surrender, until we jump overboard into His will and let Him carry us where He wishes. Verse 14, they called on the Lord. This is the sailors now. They called on the Lord and said, we earnestly pray, O Lord, do not let us perish on account of this man's life, and do not put innocent blood on us, for you, O Lord, have done as you have pleased. Now, you notice the change here? You go back to verse 5, the sailors became afraid, and their man cried to his God. Verse 5, they're praying to fish man. Then you come to verse 14, and they're praying to the true God. And I'm going to tell you that. First of all, that tells me about how unstoppable God is. God uses Jonah to reach these people. Listen, and Jonah's not even trying. He has no desire at all to help these people, yet God still worked through him. That shows us a measure of how unstoppable God is. But it makes me feel a little better. Because there's a lot of times when, even though I am walking with God, I doubt and I question whether or not God can use me in a certain situation. Well, here's a man that he's not walking with God. He's running from God, yet God still uses him. So how much more can God use us when we are walking with Him and are right with Him. So, these sailors, evidently, they've just been saved. So when you get to heaven, you can talk to these sailor boys about this event. And brand new brothers in the faith, and how do they kick off their new life as believers? Verse 15, they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea. And the sea stopped its raging. There's not many people who can say, the first thing I did as a Christian was I threw a preacher into the ocean. That's a great accomplishment. Verse 17, the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the stomach of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And here's where it really gets interesting. So come back tonight and we'll start there. But I want to ask you this question. I cannot answer it for you. Your spouse can't answer it for you. This is only a question that you can answer for yourself. Where are you at today? Not where does it look like you're at, where are you actually at? Are you headed towards Nineveh, where God has called you to go? Or is there a God storm in your life because you're running from God, doing your own thing on your way to Tarshish? And listen, we can fight all we want. And we can row against God's will all we want. But all we're going to do is hurt who? It's going to hurt ourselves. The only thing we can do, and you'll see it especially tonight, is get on our knees before God and say, God, I'm yours. I'm your slave. You do with me what you wish. And when we do that, it is amazing the things that we'll see God do. Father, thank you for this time that you've blessed us with today. I thank you for this church. I thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ. Jesus, thank you for saving us. Thank you for bringing us into the family of God. And God, thank you that you love us so much, that you have a plan for our lives, that you have a calling on our lives. And Lord, we understand that we'll never find true fulfillment and contentment and happiness and peace until we are right in the center of your will. So Father, help us to trust you. Help us to obey you and not resist you, so that we can experience the great things that you have for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Let's stand together. 411. 411. It's so sweet to trust in Jesus.
Jesus,
choir practice tonight after church. Anything else? Don't forget to pick up bags to deliver. And remember to keep Brother Joe Beasley in your prayers, and Miss Jennifer as well. Will Riley, will you dismiss us?
Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to gather here before the house today. Your brother will bring the word to us. We ask that you watch over us, protect us, and guide us throughout the week. In your name we pray. Amen.
And behold,
What a day of rejoicing that will